Amnesia the Dark Descent brought the horror game genre to the mainstream, and with good reason. It excelled at the genre like few games before or since. So when Frictional Games announced a follow-up after doing something very different with Soma, I, alongside other fans of the series, was excited, which made it even more disappointing when Amnesia Rebirth failed at the same horror its predecessor succeeded. Hello fellow humans, I am Luke, and today I would like to talk to you about the design decisions and gameplay elements that to me make Amnesia Rebirth a bad horror game for what I was expecting, and a bad follow-up to Dark Descent. This video will contain spoilers for the story. Now this game is not entirely bad. The game starts off quite well, and the first 2 hours of the game are excellent. The game starts with a strong mystery after the plane crash, and the eldritch horror elements that pop up are a great setup. Walking through the desert, keeping to the shadows is an interesting opening to a game. Not horror, but it's engaging nonetheless. As you come across the camp in the cave, the game builds up a sense of hopelessness as you read through journal entries and discover graves and bodies, diving into a different dimension, stranded, not knowing how or if you'll get back. It's fantastic. The monster growling in the distance, letting you know it is now time to hide and sneak around. Seeing statues of other people that have been petrified, making you imagine what horrible monstrosity does this, are brilliant horror setups to get you in the right mood. Next comes the desert fortification, another part well made. You are forced to go over multiple dead bodies, soldiers that had guns and cannons, which were unable to stop the monster that lurks here. The monster, always just out of reach, quickly poking through a wall, climbing up outside of a window, it lets you know it exists, and is far enough away for you to only imagine how horrific it is. This culminates in a short chase sequence, signaling that now the monster is here, and it is here to get you. After that, quick downtime. You have to find materials to build a bullet in a very confined space. This section makes it very clear with how small of a space it is and how there are no areas to hide in, that the monster will not show up here, which is one of the mistakes that this game makes. But more on that later. After this puzzle segment, you have to escape a sewer system, and this is where the cracks really start to show, and the game starts to lose its horror elements bit by bit. Initially, coming into the sewer, you see the monster crawling into one of its fleshy vents, leading you to believe that it's now time for the monster to roam, and you to sneak around the area trying to avoid it. A simple setup. First, an area introducing you to the monster and making you paranoid of it, as you see it always from the corner of your eye. Then, quick relief to catch your breath, and now the full horror sneak fest as you avoid the monster. This, however, is not how it plays out. First, more puzzles, and again in such a confined space that it lets you know there will be no monster here. But then, it happens. The monster shows up, and you are forced to hide as it blocks your path. Except there's one problem. The sequence takes 4 minutes. The entire sequence from the monster showing up to me escaping took me 4 minutes. This brings me to my first point. The game is too linear. Where the Dark Descent had massive areas with multiple rooms to explore, closets to hide, boxes to build cover with, a sprawling corridor system for the monster to patrol and you to creep around in, this game has only ever a few rooms. This first area I actually had to hide, seemingly a 4-room structure that looped in on itself. Hiding from the monster was as simple as crouching in a corner. I didn't really hide, I laid prone in a corner as the monster walked straight past me, because there was no place to hide, no closet to go into, no box to build anything with. Just static objects unfit for hiding and a cramped space. The monster didn't find me anyway, as it nearly tripped over me with how close it was. Later areas don't fix this. Every time a monster is searching for you, it's in a space far too small to play proper hide and seek. Too small to have a proper engaging phase of horror. The next time you're being hunted is over an hour later, not counting a short chase sequence where you run away from the shadow. Over an hour of doing puzzles and learning lore. Now this next area you're being hunted in is an area specifically set up for you being hunted. Large area with multiple barriers that can cut you off at pivotal moments. This would be an engaging part if it weren't for two things. They show you the monster too well, and a single death made me skip automatically to the end of it. More on both of those later. Then, in these chase sequences, an area with two paths to take where you have to walk this path back and forth to avoid a monster. Then, an area where the monster is in a singular big room with a bit of debris, and a few more where you have to move through a relatively open area from one end to the other with minimal effort along an almost linear path with more debris to hide behind. One chase you're scripted to lose, and an optional part. This is not engaging. This is not horror. Horror thrives off a big area where you have to go somewhere, not sure where, only knowing that a monster is lurking in the distance, trying to get you. Instead, Rebirth crams you into these confined spaces where you know where the monster is most of the time, forcing you to sneak around them. This is not horror, it's simple anxiety, simple adrenaline, a much cheaper form of actual horror, the discount version. The game does more to facilitate these cheap adrenaline chases. Outlast 2 was a terrible horror game. The primary reason for it, I found, was that instead of having one of these open areas where you have to hide and stealth forward, it constantly forces you to do scripted chase sequences. The monster always behind you, and you have to run to safety. Now this works in moderation. Neither Outlast 2 nor Rebirth really has this in moderation. This type of gameplay is just exhausting, and after you do it a few times it evokes nothing anymore. No anxiety, no adrenaline, only a sense of boredom as you flee the scene. Another area where this shows is my next point. In movies, show don't tell is a big part of creating an engaging narrative. In games, that would translate to do don't show, as in let the player do things themselves instead of just putting in a cutscene. Now in horror, that's even more the case. Horror is about atmosphere and about being afraid of every shadow, flinching at every noise. It's about the mind eating itself. One of these aspects is hiding from the monster instead of constantly just running from it, which was my previous point. Another aspect is that the more often you see the monster clearly, the more you engage with it, the more you know where it is, the less afraid you are. Because this is still just a game, it's unlikely that simply looking at the monster is going to cause you a feeling of horror. Maybe the first few times, but the more often you see it fully, the more you get desensitized to it, especially when the monster itself is not actually scary looking. In Rebirth, there are 3 types of monsters to my knowledge, only one of which I will consider scary looking, that being the ghoul. The other 2 are a human partway transforming into one of these ghouls, being entirely too human still to be scary, and one floating ghost with strings for a face. Now this alone would not be bad if those monsters were far away and rarely seen, but that is again not what this game does. The human lifts you up in a cutscene, letting you see all its non-scary features before simply discarding you. This is a thing that happens every time you get caught. The monster lifts you up, letting you see all of its features before you get away, die, or whatever the game has planned. This completely breaks the tension of a chase. While a scripted chase should not be overused, if you screw up your hiding and the monster does see you, that should always result in a chase. Now if you're being lifted up into a short cutscene where you have practically no input, that totally shatters the tension of this chase. How did Dark Descent handle this? Claw marks across the screen letting you know you've been hit, but still letting you run. This increases the tension of the chase, as you are more threatened than ever, but Rebirth copies another bad part of Outlast with these you've been caught cutscenes. And the ghoul? While the ghoul never caught me, there is another point where the game does not want you to be scared of them anymore, but just cringe at their existence. One of the previously mentioned chase sequences has you sneak through a room full of dozens of these ghouls sleeping. You have to sneak past them as one wakes up and begins looking for you. This once again it's overexposure. The game doesn't want you to be scared anymore, it wants you to be anxious. It shows too much of the monster. Now Dark Descent had a few areas that you knew were safe. They gave the player a small bit of relief, which is needed, as constant stress is very tiring, making you lose the capacity to properly be scared anymore. Besides that, Amnesia Dark Descent has areas with puzzles in it, yet a puzzle does not mean you are safe. Monsters could still be prowling while you have to do a task in an area, and even in some areas that seem safe, you just can never be quite sure if you actually are. It creates this effect with its level design. A single closet could mean you have to hide in it. Just a few boxes give you the option of creating a hiding area for yourself if a monster shows up. Rebirth has practically none of this. No closets, no boxes. This, alongside the general atmosphere of areas, makes it incredibly easy to know which areas will have a monster in it and which won't and are just puzzle areas. This breaks the horror aspect even more. If I always know when I'm safe and when not, there's no horror, no tension. Now, a good horror game would use these senses against you, luring you to a false sense of security and then tearing it away from you. Rebirth tries this, but fails, as the only time a monster shows up in one of these save areas, it's more of an introduction to the floaty string face ghost in a singular room in a sequence that takes maybe 2 minutes to escape and then never does this again. Now let's talk briefly about the struggle against the dark mechanic. Where Dark Descent had Daniel faint when his sanity got too low, Rebirth has you mash WASD and move the mouse violently as you try not to die, or lose control, as there is no dying. This mechanic is terrible. It's not fun, and every time I had to do it, I increasingly got annoyed. And when I'm annoyed, I'm not scared. Furthermore, as the struggle has you get up, it would make you unable to hide, which would make hiding nearly impossible, if it weren't for the fact that the game does not have you hide much anyway, and makes the points you do have to hide incredibly easy. So if struggle does not make it harder and more annoying to hide, what's the point of it? Story. It has to show how Tasi is slowly losing control of her own body. Now this would be interesting, but again Rebirth does not pull it off correctly. Firstly, it makes you unable to die. Instead, when you would die, you lose control of the game and you see flashes of the character running around the area before waking up in a seemingly random spot. This completely skipped an entire hunt sequence for me once, which just felt strange as the game was practically playing itself. Another story side effect of this is that Tasi is slowly turning into one of these ghouls. This means, however, that you are stronger than ever. At one point, you tear off the arm of one of these monsters and kill another human you're trying to save. Now, knowing how strong you're becoming, and death is impossible, why should you ever be scared? You could tear the monster apart clearly, and if you fail, you just wake up somewhere else. There's no stakes, no point. Now, this could be fine if the game did something with it. If you died too often, you would lose yourself in the ending. Forced into a bad situation because you lost control too often. Kill people you were trying to save because you lost control too often during the game. Because the black veins, which is the sign of losing control, showed up more heavily on my character towards the end of the game, I genuinely believed that this was going to happen and was excited to get the bad ending because I realized too late what the game wanted. But was that the case? No, of course not. The ending has you make a choice, which leads you one of its 3 endings, and as far as I know, that's it. So the entire struggle mechanic, pointless, no payoff, nothing. It just adds frustration to the game. Finally, let's talk about the story. The stakes that the game wants to have. Tasi realizes at some point that she's in fact pregnant. This is taken as the magic solution, as now everything you do is supposed to have more gravity, because that baby needs to live. If you turn into a mindless monster, the baby will die or also be a monster or something. It's never really clarified, but I'm sure it's super bad. My problem with that is how badly they handle all of that. In gaming, the story and gameplay should enhance each other, But here the baby worsens the experience of the gameplay. The baby can kick you at random times, and you can feel your belly to calm your sanity. Except the baby kicks often, and if you don't engage with it, it sometimes makes you freeze in place regardless, or at least worsens your movement. This is especially annoying when you have to turn a wheel, which barely works in this game, and the baby kicks, making you lose grip and the wheel starts turning back. The mechanic feels tacked on, almost to have another way to get rid of the darkness haunting you, so you don't have to struggle against the dark as often. As the story progresses, you get further and further along this pregnancy, which makes Tazi feel slower and slower, as well as grow quicker and quicker out of breath. On a narrative level, this makes sense of course, but on a gameplay level, this is incredibly unfun. It could be interesting to have to hide from the monster as you get increasingly slower, but again, that happens too rarely to be of note. Instead, I would like to talk about one specific point in the story that is framed as incredibly dramatic, but after the frustration and annoyance of the struggle mechanic, the baby mechanic, and the slower and slower speed of gameplay as well as the way it's set up, I could not help bursting out laughing. In a sequence in which you are near birth, you have to waddle along a very linear path in the least engaging part of the game so far, are being caught in a trap, and one of your former friends, turning into a ghoul, frees you and tells you to run. In another scripted chase sequence, you have to slowly run away, but you're doomed to fail because of how slow you are, and why don't I just show you?
Run, Tessie! I can't control it!
Slow, pregnant jogging while being hunted by a friend.
It was you!
That
You did this!
I don't know why, but this is the most laughable fucking
You did
shit.
this to me!
This is so. It's the most laughable fucking shit. I don't know. This isn't horror. This is just. This shit's hilarious. You know, not as a concept,
Doctor!
I've got you.
but because I have to
baby.
fucking waddle along. This is
It's all
the
right.
least engaging gameplay I've ever seen. Well, that's not actually true.
Gotcha.
I've seen worse, surprisingly. So the game frames itself as if protecting this child is the most important thing in the world, because it's a child. While Dark Descent had you slowly uncover what horrible person Daniel has become in his search for glory and understanding, and then in the end you have to decide what a person you want to be by choosing one of the endings. Here the entire narrative boils down to you pregnant, protect baby, which feels weirdly hollow and cheap in comparison, especially because of the ending. Instead of what I hoped it would be, where how often you have lost control would be a central point, you choose one of 3 linear options. Like Dark Descent, except with less of the implications, less of the build-up, while in Dark Descent you slowly learned what happened, which then leads into the final decision. Here you learn everything that happens and then make a choice that feels somewhat detached from what you've been doing so far. You could already choose to sacrifice someone to maybe cure your baby, which might have an illness, earlier. But again, as far as I know, that has no influence on the ending at all. So it doesn't matter. The final choice comes down to a bit of exposition. Your baby will die if you don't leave it with the queen of that realm. Or at least, the queen of that realm tells you so. And then you can decide if you want to leave with the baby, or leave the baby and become a ghoul. Or kill everyone, but that ending is strange anyway. Now this choice feels weirdly hollow to me, because while the entire game does build up to you regaining the knowledge that you refused to give this queen your baby, so the entire Crash group may live, the ending isn't really a meaningful choice, as they are dead already. The damage has been done. It's now just you and the baby. So will you let this baby stay with this weird queen in an empty, dead world? Or go home with it, give it a few years with a loving mother, and maybe cure it with advancing technology? What a choice that is. Now in conclusion, I would like to say that this game could have been fun if engaged with in a different context. If played more like an eldritch horror story game like Conarium, this might have been fun apart from some terrible mechanics. But sadly, this game didn't come out to be a story game with a few horror elements and annoying mechanics. This game came out as the follow-up to Amnesia, The Dark Descent, a well-executed horror game with an excellent story, which is why this game fundamentally fails as a sequel in the Amnesia series.